Family is what most people would consider the most important thing in a person's life. As the famous old saying goes, blood is thicker than water. They are with you from the beginning of your life and most likely till the end of your life. No matter how people come and go, your family will always be there for you. In some countries, your entire identity revolves around your family. Everything you do also symbolizes your family. In some cases, there's a sense of pride that every step you take, you're also representing your family. But in others, it's like a stain in your name that you cannot remove no matter how many times you wipe it clean. But if family value is considered sacred, what happens when you do cross the line by killing a relative? What happens if that person is your father? What bond is broken there, and how does it get to the extent of murdering your blood relative? While morally, it's the sort of crime that any person would be taken aback by, for some countries it's worthy of capital punishment or life imprisonment. But then another question arises. Is that person deserving of a harsh punishment for, let's say, killing their father, when their own father has done even more heinous acts towards them? That is the question that this case, Aizawa versus Japan, answers. 1939 is a year that most historians remember by heart, as this was the beginning of World War II. During the first year, Germany began the war by invading Poland. Around this time, Japan had yet to join the war, only joining a year later. This was a time of turmoil for most countries, and specifically in Japan, citizens were in constant fear of bombs dropping, evacuating their homes, and separating from their families. According to the National Park Service article, Japan during the World War II, more than 1 million Japanese children evacuated, splitting up families in the process. Food shortages were abundant throughout the country. Approximately 2 million Japanese people died by the end of the war. In the center of all the chaos, there was a baby born in 1939. Her name is Aizawa Chiyo, whom I will be referring to by her first name, as it will make sense why I chose to do so later. She was the first of 6 children to Aizawa Takeo and Rika, who I will also refer them by their first names. And just for reference, there weren't a whole lot of English-speaking articles regarding Chiyo's background or anyone else connected to the case. And with the articles that I could find, it repeated the same paragraphs word for word. The most I can provide is a context of what was happening around the time of the case. Just like Chiyo, I could not find much regarding her parents either. What I could find is that Takeo was known for being a violent alcoholic and would abuse his family frequently. Her mother was no different from the rest of the family and was also a victim of her husband's wrath. In 1953, Rika finally made the biggest decision of her life and chose to leave for Hokkaido along with the rest of her children, leaving behind Chiyo and another one of her daughters. At the time, Chiyo was around 14 years old. Eventually, her sister had also left after graduating from high school to find work outside the city. This left Chiyo to be the main target of her father's abuse, and nobody would ever expect what came next. Chiyo was subjected to one of the most horrible abuse ever. For the next 15 years, she was brutally raped by her father. She fell pregnant 11 times by her abuser, 6 of which were abortions. Of the 5 she did give birth, they were all daughters, but 2 had died during infancy. Despite giving birth to her father's daughters, she loved them a lot and showed them the care that he did not provide. She has been abused for so long that neighbors thought that she was his wife. Eventually, her mother, Rika, finally chose to return to her husband and daughter. However, after returning, she found out the horrible truth that her husband had made their biological daughter into his wife. Now, I couldn't find any English translated articles to detail more about Chiyo's mother, so I couldn't find if she stayed or just accepted things as they were. So things were a little unclear regarding their relationship. At some point, Chiyo was able to find work to support her family financially, and she was around 29 years old. In 1968, she fell in love with a 22-year-old coworker and wished that she could marry him. Takeo became enraged when he found out about her wishes. Whether it be because he was jealous that his daughter had her eyes set on somebody else who wasn't her biological father, or because he was afraid that he was going to lose control of his victim. This was enough for her father to become belligerent. He held her hostage in her own home and did not allow her to leave. If she tried to escape, then he would threaten to kill their daughters. In October of the same year, she was no longer able to keep living this cycle of abuse. That night, he came home drunk, and as per usual, he repeated his sexual violence. This resulted in her overpowering him and strangling him to death. After killing her father, she confessed to a store owner who ultimately reported this to the police, where she was arrested. For this segment of the video, I'm going to go into detail about how the Japanese law works as well as its culture. However, I'm not a professional when it comes to Japan, so please take what I say with a grain of salt. If you're interested in the functions of Japanese law and culture, then I would suggest you do your own research. Otherwise, the rest of the video will stray away from the crime itself and focus more on the law's flaws. Nowadays, it's seemingly clear that she was a victim of horrendous mistreatment. While yes, she murdered somebody, anybody would say that a decade and a half of abuse is a far more criminal act morally. However, back in the late 60s to early 70s, this was a controversial case. At the time, Japan had an article under the criminal code that allowed a harsher punishment for those who committed parricide. Under Article 200 of Japan's criminal code, the murder of one's lineal ascendants is worthy of capital punishment or life imprisonment. There were only 2 reductions allowed in jail sentencing for parricides. This means that the severity of the punishment can be reduced to half of the original sentencing per reduction. Therefore, Chio would have to serve 7 years. The court did not allow suspended sentencing for more than 3 years, so she would have to serve 3 years and 6 months. And that's only if they believe she deserved the lightest sentencing. And here's the controversial part. By law, she would receive the punishment for parricide rather than regular homicide. With homicide, she could be sentenced to 2 years or less considering the abuse she endured. With parricide, she would have to serve 3.5 years or more. Not only that, but it will still be on her record even after she served her sentence, despite what her father had done to her for 15 years. While she had technically broken Article 200 of the Criminal Code, most people would argue that convicting her based on her family origin, that being her father's daughter, convicting her will contradict Article 14, which is, all people are equal under the law and there shall be no discrimination in political, economic, or social relations because of race, creed, sex, social status, or family origin. Chio's case can fall under the protection of Article 14. Therefore, convicting her due to her family status is considered discriminatory. Plus, her lawyer argued that she did it out of self-defense and had become insane due to the innumerable amount of times she was raped. Okay, so from a Western lens, it all might sound insane to have a separate ruling just for murdering an older relative, but I'm sure for most people this isn't too surprising. Most Asian cultures, Japan included, have been heavily inspired by filial piety, which is a Confucius belief that one must show respect and love for one's parents, elders, and ancestors. Family is deeply ingrained in Japanese society. Your entire identity is connected to them. What you do will represent them, and what they do will represent you. That's why in any Japanese media you watch, whether it be anime or shows or movies, they refer to each other by their last names when they first meet. This belief is brought to Japan around the 17th century and has been passed down throughout the generations. Filial piety was the basis for creating Article 200. Ultimately, on May 29, 1969, the Utsunomiya District Court acquitted her of her charges as they considered Article 200 unconstitutional and that her actions were a result of self-defense. However, on May 12, 1970, just a year later, the Tokyo High Court did not agree with this and thus sentenced her to the 3 years and 6 months. In their eyes, Article 200 is not considered unreasonable as respecting your ascendants was and is still the social norm, that it is a universal ethic. The majority were on the basis that killing one's parents violates what they considered the most basic human nature compared to any other homicide. They had argued that those who committed parricide deserve the harshest punishment because it is the most repugnant crime, therefore concluding that tradition is more important than the equal treatment of their citizens. On April 4, 1973, an appeal was submitted to the Supreme Court of Japan, and they ruled that Article 200 was unconstitutional. Separating parricide from ordinary homicide implies that some lives are more important than others, which contradicts Article 14, the right to equality. In reality, homicide against anyone in general, quote, should be repugnant in basic principle of human ethics, according to Charles Q. Q's article goes into more detail about the reasoning behind the court's decision, such as explaining the cultural impact of Confucius beliefs as well as covering Japan's history affecting this case. I highly recommend reading his article if you want a better understanding of this case. I put his article in the description in case anybody's interested. For example, how does one argue that murdering a child unrelated to you is more ethical than killing your abusive father? The Tokyo High Court's decision to sentence her was not based on what was in law, but based on sorely outdated tradition. So outdated that they previously abolished the EA system in 1947. The system includes the son, the wife, their child, and grandparents. So this implies that the Japanese government is acutely aware that the familial practice is not progressive whatsoever. And yet they completely brushed over this hypocrisy and chose tradition over the law to judge Chiyo's case. They had agreed that the penalty was too harsh and that Chiyo's rights to equality were violated. She was discriminated against in court due to her family relations with her father. Ultimately, they rewrote the charges from parricide to regular homicide, and her sentencing was changed to 2 years and 6 months. Only a year difference. The Japanese Supreme Court had failed Chiyo, allowing tradition to override legal reasoning. As Charles Q stated in his article, the fact that the ruling was based not on legal reasoning but squarely on their value judgment renders the ruling open to debate. The failure to outlaw Article 200 for breaching the equality principle under Article 14 clearly indicates the high degree of influence of traditional values over the Japanese judiciary. Of the 3 court cases that had challenged Article 200 against Article 14 of equality, the Aizawa versus Japan case was the only one that had fallen through the cracks due to subjective judgment from those who refused to allow old traditions to dissipate, all simply because of her relations to her murder victim. She was eventually acquitted of her crimes and moved to Utsunomiya for work after her release. Since then, she has managed to stay low and continues to live a peaceful life, despite the mistreatment from not only her father, but Japan's judicial system as well. On April 19, 1973, following her new sentencing, the Japanese Ministry of Justice declared that those who have been convicted of parricide can be granted amnesty, and in 1995, Article 200 was officially abolished. Thank you for watching my 4th video. This one was pretty short, but I wanted to make a video on this one because it was so intriguing to see traditional values overpower legal judgment. It was such a shame that the courts kind of forgot that Chiyo had gone through 15 years of horrible abuse. Instead, they were like, yeah, but you killed your dad. Like, put yourself in her shoes and see if you'd be chill knowing that you can be sentenced to life in prison for protecting yourself from your abuser. Anyways, thank you again for watching my video, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.